On this day in history in 1865, John Wilkes Booth shot President Abraham Lincoln at the Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. That attack came just days after General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, which effectively marked the beginning of the end of the Civil War. Booth entered the presidential box during the performance and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. The president was carried across the street to the Peterson House, where he died the following morning, April 15th, 1865. Lincoln became the first United States president to be assassinated. Booth escaped to Virginia after that shooting, but was found 12 days later by Union soldiers and ultimately shot and killed.